This is Chris from Deus Ex Machina, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about gender pronouns. And I know some of you are going to prejudge what the conversation is going to be about. I'm not going to be proselytizing or preaching or trying to push some agenda. Actually, I probably will, because that's what I do. But anyway, I want to talk about how writers, specifically game writers, have been employing gender pronouns and how we can adapt and change into the future, more or less revolving around the term they, as being embraced as a singular gender neutral pronoun. Now, it should be noted that the idea of they as a singular pronoun is relatively accepted by a lot of people, but a lot of others, especially grammar Nazis, like to enforce the belief that they is plural and it should never ever be used as a singular pronoun, despite the fact that it has been unofficially employed as a singular pronoun for about 600 years. In fact, it's also been codified by grammarians, which is a term I just discovered, and English professors are saying no, they is actually accepted, and they've codified it several times. I think the last time was in the 1970s. But despite this, the vast majority of writers haven't gotten that memo. They don't use they as a singular pronoun. They don't, and I've gone through a lot of books, and I rarely ever see they use in a singular pronoun, especially in game writing. Now, I'm sure there's some games out there that have, but I'm referring to the big publications, and I'm going through all the fantasy ones here in just a second. Now, English is cursed with that kind of handicap. Other languages do have genderless pronouns, and some of them have developed gender pronouns. The Dutch, for example, I think it was the Dutch created hen, which is a kind of a mix between the him and her, and unfortunately that doesn't work so well with the English language, just because of how similar ours are. But that still creates a situation where you want to make sure that it is genderless, where you can include non-binary and genderless individuals. But with the English language, we're kind of stuck with they. You know, people will say there's also it. It's rather derogatory. It is basically reserved for animals and, for some strange reason, babies. I don't know why that is, but that's the way it is. But we kind of recognize that, at least recently, we've been able to recognize that the imposing of the default him as the gender of default within the English language is something that was enforced by a male-dominated society, more, you know, commonly pushed outside of that from an imperialist England, basically. And that's what we employ. Now, eventually, we kind of worked off of him, her, his, her type of thing, like him or her, and include that, but it's very, very clumsy, and very few places use them. We do see those situations, or they reword it in such a way that where they can use a plural, they can say people and then say they, but there's very few situations where we can specifically say they in singular. And specifically with games, we see a very interesting pattern as we move from the late 70s to today. Right off the bat, let's look up the classic Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook. Now, with this book, they do kind of do their best to refer to a player in the third person, but more often than not, they do employ a gender definition, and in this situation they are using him or her, or, you know, in almost every situation when they're implying when a fighter attains 9th level, he or she may opt to establish a freehold. So that is how they employ it. It's almost entirely third person, and when they have to imply a gender, they'll do him and her, or he or she, and that was kind of the way people did it for a very, very long time. Now, when we go into the next book, something very weird happens. Now, I don't have second edition, so we'll have to skip that. I'm going to just go right to Player's Handbook. Now, Player's Handbook 3.5, I don't have the third edition. There's very similar writing between the two of them. The tense is, and the references are basically the same. Now, when we get to races, they refer to it as a third person, and most often than not, it's plural. Humans have no special bonus or penalty due to their size. Human base speed lands 30 feet. So when they have to refer to a gender, if they have to say they will shift it to a plural. So dwarves gain this because they gain that. And then occasionally they'll use a single. A halfling gains this ability. But when they have to use they shift the conversation so it's a plural. And that's very common. But this is where things get a little weird. So with the races, they're referring to the halfling, and they are referring to the third person, and they're saying they when it comes to plural. When we get to classes, it changes. At that point, they start defining gender with each class. And it took me a while to figure this out. And the best way to understand it is to look at the illustration. And in certain situations, they will say him or her. But then other situations, they won't. A druid can cast spells of an alignment opposed to her own or her deity, if she has one. Now, why did they shift from a him or her? Because in cleric, we just saw a him or her reference, but why is druid a her? Why is druid a her? And then we get to fighter. Fighter chains. The fighter excels in a straight fight, but he relies on others for magical support. So we shifted the definition from male to female. So, and why is that? And the best way to explain that is the illustration. Female druid, male fighter. And the illustration appears to kind of define which direction that they will go with their gender in the book. I know, it's very interesting. There might be some exceptions, but I haven't found one. Paladin is female, sorcerer is male, rogue is female, and then the gender and the descriptions follow accordingly. That's a strange thing. But then it gets stranger, because when they reference combat and get into spells, they shift it again. They go to a second perspective. They go to you. Instead of a first perspective, which is I, and a third perspective, which is him or her, we're going to a second perspective. We're going to you. You gain this, you gain that, which is kind of weird. So it refers to you, the player, at that point. And player is actually a great thing to say, because player is a great gender-neutral word. And you can say players with they, but player is still not referenced as they. Player is still given a he or she or him or her distinction, but they try their best to avoid that. But when we get to the last half of the book, it completely shifts over to the second perspective of you. It's almost like this book had sections that were assigned to different people, and they made different decisions. And we'll also see that, like, this is a strange thing. You think that this wouldn't be replicated, but it is. We'll get into that in a second. Yes, my Player's Handbook is in this poor condition. I am sorry, but I did get a lot of use out of this thing. So the Player's Handbook for 4th edition has a bunch of brand new writers, and in this book, it shifts almost 100% of all of its pronouns to the second perspective, you. It always references you, the player, you, the character. You gain this, you gain that. This is what you can do. Now, in certain situations, referencing allies and so forth, there's going to be a situation where they basically have to refer to somebody other than you. So what do? Well, they default it to the female pronoun. It's almost, I haven't found an exception to this. It's almost always going to be a female pronoun. You know, if you cast a spell, your ally can spend a healing surge, and she gains this number of hit points. It's a very interesting decision. Once again, they made the conscious effort saying, say you throughout all of it, and if you have to define a gender, go with the female pronoun. It's a very interesting thing, and since the same writers did 13th Age, I wouldn't be surprised if that followed that same pattern. But this is kind of the shift going forward, shifting it from a third perspective to a second perspective, or so you would think, because we get the Pathfinder. Now, Pathfinder has a lot of the same writers as a 3.5. A lot of them carried over, and they're also using the same kind of content. It is 3.75. And they follow that formula for the 3.5. In the races, it's almost entirely referred to as plural. Dwarves, halflings, humans gain this. When you get to the classes, once again, it follows that pattern of the illustration appears to define the gender definition employed by the class. The bard it has the illustration that implies a male, therefore the class references as a him, as a his, and then when we get to combat and spells, it shifts over to the second perspective, you. So they did the exact same thing that the 3.5 D&D. It makes sense, of course. This is a built off of the same formula. Which brings us finally to, well, not finally, but Player's Handbook, 5th edition. Yes, I had a coil bound. I do get a lot of use out of this thing. Now, this one follows the 4th edition formula. Almost every single instance is you. I don't see a single time that they don't reference the second perspective of you in almost every instance. There are a few occasions where they do refer to someone other than you, and that's generally a creature, and a creature is referred to as it. That can imply an ally or not, but it's generally how they work. And I bet you if there is a gender usage anywhere in this book, it's probably going to be a female gender pronoun, because this is probably them replicating what happened with 4th edition. But that's how this one did it. It almost implies, almost entirely uses the second pronoun you. Now, if you find the Pathfinder 2nd edition, the Pathfinder 2nd edition adopts that same formula. They shift the entire tense to second, and now is referencing to you in almost every instance. Which is interesting, and we're moving into this new direction where we can say you as a way of getting out of having to say define a gender. Which brings us to board games. Now, you think board games would probably follow a similar pattern, and they do. If we look at an old game like Castle Panic. Now, Castle Panic is at least 10, if not more, years old, and it came out around the same time as Pandemic, around that same time period, and so the manual references a third person and says his or her, so it uses the him or her, which is a little clunky, but that's their decision. They go with the third person perspective, and they use the two genders, which I say is clunky and doesn't really help the situation, as it doesn't include everyone in the spectrum. But when we get to something like Haven is a newer manual. Haven references second person, so it almost always references you, the player. Now, you would think that that would be common. Of course, that's how they do it. But it isn't. There are still tons of games out there that are still trying to push him or her or enforce a him gender as the pronoun of a preference. And in this situation, there is an example. There's a game called Micropolis, which I would show you, but I culled it from my collection. I don't own it anymore. And it's a relatively, I wouldn't say an obscure game. It's Bruno Catala. So he's a very well-known game creator. And it uses the him pronoun throughout the entire game manual. But they put a disclaimer in. The disclaimer reads, throughout this document, male pronouns are used for the sake of simplicity and readability. In each instance, the rules are meant to include players of any gender. Now, I'll say thank you for adding a disclaimer, but then I have to ask, why did you have to write it with the male gender at all? Why couldn't you use the second perspective like so many people are saying and saying you? Why didn't you just say him or her? Because him or her is considered clunky, is considered, improper. We're still in this situation where they still refuse to employ they as a singular pronoun. I've had arguments with people who insist that, no, they is proper as a single pronoun. Everyone knows this. I go, no, nobody knows this. No writer is using this. Every writer has been trained from birth to not use they as a plural pronoun. But now it has. And I, for one, am relieved by this development and this new acceptance of they as a singular pronoun, because I have been using they as a singular pronoun for decades, and I constantly get corrected from people and told it's wrong, that I can't use it, or I catch it myself and I have to go back and I change it. And it now is in a situation where you can use they singular. Professors, they embrace it. Grammarians embrace it. A lot of people embrace it. We embrace it in our casual conversation. We do say they. But for some reason, the moment we hit documents, we constantly, oh, I can't say they now. You can and you should, especially when you're dealing with a situation where a gender is not defined. And like I said, with my books, Ultramodern 5 and a few others, most of my books are from 2015 or earlier. Most of these times I follow the 4th edition formula. I reference you, second perspective in almost every regard, but in when I have no choice and I have to define a gender, I switch to her. Is that a good idea? Yeah, I think it was good for the time, but nowadays I wouldn't be doing that. Now with Affinity, which is what I'm working on now, whenever there's a situation where I can't use gender, if I can't define, I have to use a gendered pronoun, I will be using they, just because it's easier. And if a grammar Nazi goes after me, I can say, hey, it's a new world. They is now an accepted singular pronoun, and it has been for at least 40 years. Get with the times. But more than that, of course, is dealing with the races. Now, Affinity has 3 books, and in each book there is one little instance where I play with pronouns based off of the rules. The first are the Daemons in Paradise. Daemons in Paradise are an angelic species made of light that walk around in a skin suit, basically. And if that sounds familiar, yes, they are inspired by the aliens in the classic film Cocoon. And they eventually, depending on the feats you select, you can gain additional suits that you can change as easily as you can change clothes. And you adopt the gender, if there is one, of that suit. And that means, of course, that you are very fluid in that gender definition. You can stick with one gender throughout all the clothes you have, or you can switch it on the fly. I thought it was a very cool idea. It was an interesting mechanic, and I employ it. But when I reference them, they are always referenced as they, as a singular pronoun. In the Taurus, we have the loginoids, which are machines, but I didn't want to use the pronoun it, so in reference to them, we use they for the pronoun for the loginoids. Metrons are a little different. Metrons are a class in Conestoga. They have something also interesting, where when you become a Metron class, a spellcaster literally reshapes your mind and body to become a spellcaster. You have to be psychically aware, and then they reshape your psychic power in order to be a Metron class. But when they do that, they can shape you in other ways. They can change your eye color, your height, and your gender as a result. It's all up. You can change it up in the whim when you get that shift over, so you can be born and then you can transition when you become a Metron. And that's something I thought was really, really cool. So there are instances where I'm playing with the gender and gender pronouns within Affinity, and this is something that that I'm very happy to offer, because I think it adds a fun level of creativity. But as a writer, getting to finally use they as a singular pronoun is a relief, because it's something that I've been battling with for decades. So when you see me using they as a singular pronoun, you can go after me, and I'll still say that it's entirely proper. It has been accepted in our language. I am not really making a political or a statement. I am simply defaulting back to the way I used to write for decades, and I get to write that way again. So that was my little commentary on gender pronouns in game writing. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I will probably have some more videos for you all in the coming weeks. Thank you.